The first stage of the Christian philosophy debates I mark as beginning in 1931 with the Société Française de Philosophie session devoted to the problem of Christian philosophy. And I think that it ends sometime in 1932 before the publication of several important books. Etienne Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. This is the translation of it. Those were his Gifford lectures that he delivered in 1931 and 1932. Maurice Blondel's Le Problème de la Philosophie Catholique, also published in 1932. And a book that I don't have here, Jacques Moritain's Essay on Christian Philosophy, which is published a little bit later. He gave a presentation which is a bridge point between his presentation during the Société Française de Philosophie session and the book that would later become his Essay on Christian Philosophy, in which he targeted Blondel. By the way, Blondel targeting Gilson in this book, and Moritain. Gilson targeting Blondel in this book, among other people. The debate was already well going by that time, a lot of controversy, a lot of lines being drawn. So in my book, the translations that I have some of the documents from this early part of the debates, the 1931 to, say, mid-1932. I don't have all of it, in part because you can only include so much, and also because the Société Française de Philosophie would not actually give permission to have the entirety of the session translated, only Gilson's portion. That session, like I said, a portion of which remains untranslated at this time, but which I do have translations of that I can supply people with unofficially if they would like. That session really marks the beginning of the debates. And the reason I choose that is because you have to have some way of marking when something begins. As a historian, granted, there's a whole prehistory of the debates. There's a lot of things going into it. Some of the major lines had already been drawn before that. But that's a good point of demarcation. So what took place? Well, in early 1931, there were already some things being published about Christian philosophy, and the Société Française de Philosophie had arranged to have a meeting, a debate. And this is what they did year after year after year. They would bring together some of the great French philosophers on a given topic. Sometimes they would actually bring in some other people. And they would set out the different sides. They would make presentations, and then they would argue with each other. And that's what took place here. So Gilson, Etienne Gilson, and Léon Brunswig had already clashed about the nature of Thomistic philosophy. Was it really philosophy? This was a great debate that was going on. Gilson was on one side, and Jacques Moritain was his ally on that side, saying yes, definitely it is philosophy. It's a robust philosophy. It is indebted to Christianity, but it is still philosophical. On the other side, Léon Brunswig, also Emile Bréhier, who had recently staked out a position saying there is no such thing as Christian philosophy. Thomism, Augustinianism, Hegelianism, all these attempts to have a Christian philosophy had all been colossal failures. And the lines were drawn. So it would be Gilson on one side and the young Bréhier on the other side. Meanwhile, sort of in their corners would be Jacques Moritain to support Gilson, and Gilson's old teacher, also Blondel's old teacher, Léon Brunswig. Those were the rationalists versus the what you could call existential Thomists. Now, another group wasn't in the debate at that time, but they were actually opposed to Christian philosophy, and that was the neo-scholastic Thomists, who had said that no, Thomism, insofar it is philosophy, it's purely philosophical, and as soon as God starts coming in the picture or anything like that, it becomes theology. And they were sort of capitulating to the rationalists. But there were some other positions represented as well that didn't make it into the debates. Blondel was not able to attend the sessions. Blondel had some severe health problems that had begun in the late 1920s that actually necessitated him stepping down as a professor of philosophy. And he had become progressively more and more blind. He really could not see much at all. He had to work through having a secretary read things to him, and then the secretary would take dictation. It's remarkable how much he actually got done. Blondel had a different position than the Thomists did. And actually, Blondel's position on Thomism was changing at this time. Blondel was a completely original thinker who was revitalizing Christian philosophy from the ground up. And like a lot of original thinkers, he was misunderstood by his own allies. As a matter of fact, there's really, if you look at it closely, there's no good reason why he and Gilson should have been at odds like they were, but they were. So, let me lay out the sides. You have the Thomists over here, proponents of Christian philosophy. You have the rationalists over here, opponents of Christian philosophy. You have Blondel staking out his own position for Christian philosophy, but in a different understanding of it than Gilson and Maritain. Also very critical of Gilson and Maritain's position. Gilson and Maritain returned the favor by criticizing Blondel's position. My contention is they actually misunderstood each other quite a bit, and some of that may have been due to past history that I'll talk about in another video. Some of it may have just been an uncharacteristic lack of Christian charity on the part of those participants towards each other. So, the battle lines get drawn. How are they drawn? They come together, Gilson gives his presentation, and he and Bréhier start going back and forth. And it is a complete rout. Gilson stakes out a position that argues that there is a Christian philosophy. He has some very beautiful passages about that. I'm not going to give you those here because I'm reading those into podcasts. Bréhier gives his presentation. Gilson and Bréhier go back and forth. Then Jacques Maritain gives his position. And this is the first place where Maritain stakes out a position that he'll later revise, and then revise again, and continue revising through several different steps, adding more and more each point, making it more and more precise. Maritain comes up with the notion of Christian philosophy as philosophy in a Christian state, as opposed to philosophy's essence, which is ahistorical, not tied to any particular system or culture. Philosophy within a Christian culture develops as Christian philosophy, or as Maritain would say, in a Christian regime. Then Brunswick says his piece, and Brunswick says some startling things. He says, I would not recognize myself as a philosopher if Christianity had not existed. He even admits that there could be some figures that would embody Christian philosophy. Malebranche, he thinks, Nicolas Malebranche is one of them, and Pascal is actually one of them, and he says Pascal has a way of philosophizing that is not that of the philosophers. But really, what he thinks is that Christianity is something that's going to be left behind as mankind becomes brighter and brighter, to take on, one of the memes or catchphrases that the Brights like to use. They would gradually slough it off. He and Gilson get into a back and forth conversation, and it's very different than the one with Bréhier. There's no definite winner, there's no definite conclusion, and you can see the two sides working themselves out in the process. So how does it come about that Maurice Blondel, nearly blind rather, living apart from Paris, outside of the currents of intellectual events, comes into this Christian philosophy debate? Well, at least with the Société Française de Philosophie session, it happens because he is invited to participate via correspondence. And this is how he actually did it through some other sessions as well, the Société d'études philosophiques, for example. He is invited to contribute because he's a major philosopher, he's considered a brilliant mind, and he has a lot to say about Christian philosophy. Although actually his preferred term is not Christian philosophy, but as you see here, philosophie catholique, Catholic philosophy. And we can talk about reasons why that is in another video. So, what takes place involves a little bit of fast dealings on Blondel's part. Kind of uncharacteristic, because he was a guy who was scrupulously honest, and he was always very charitable to his opponents. Somehow that went out the window with respect to Gilson. Gilson was another guy like that, who took offense at what Blondel did when he didn't have to. And it could be because their positions were actually so close and in some ways required each other in order to work, that maybe it's something like the fight between brothers. I don't know. I'd have to think about that more. In any case, here's what happened. Gilson gives Blondel a copy of the outline to his presentation. Blondel has that read to him and writes a response to it, or rather dictates a response to it. That goes to Gilson. Gilson thinks that that's what he's going to hear read at the session. Gilson writes the rest of his presentation, takes into account Blondel's original criticisms, which are not quite as trenchant as the later ones, and Blondel is not actually supposed to have a copy of that. Blondel gets a copy of that through some behind-the-scenes pulling strings, and he rewrites his response, his letter, that he's going to use, and he's very critical of Gilson. And it's not just that he's critical, it's that he's deeply critical. He is targeting Gilson at some of the weaker points of the Gilson, Jacques Maritain, existential Thomist position. He's hitting him, sometimes you might say, where it counts. Not death blows, because Blondel's philosophy will fill in the gaps of Gilson's, just like Gilson's and Maritain's will fill in the gaps in Blondel's. But enough to sort of sever the connection between those. And those sides then split apart. So at the same time, the people that have already gotten involved, that have staked out a claim, you might say, Bréhier, Blondel, Brunswick, Maritain, they start publishing their own pieces, and they are further developing their claims. They're responding to each other. Blondel was actually targeting Gilson specifically in his piece attached to the Société Française de Philosophie session, which is translated in here. But he also responds to Bréhier directly in another piece that's also translated in here. Brunswick's de la vraie et la fausse conversion comes out. That ties in with it as well. That's sort of the ending point of Brunswick's contribution. There's one other thing that's taking place in this period, which makes it in some ways kind of a fallow period. They're the very important participants, Blondel, Maritain, Gilson, to a lesser extent Sertillanges, and people like van Steenbergen. They are gearing up. They are thinking. They are working out their thoughts in more detail. Gilson is going to England and giving the Gifford lectures, and here he's working out his understanding of Christian philosophy further. This is an advance beyond his presentation at the Société Française de Philosophie. He'll actually reverse some of his stances on things, like the nature of Augustinian philosophy as philosophy. And those sort of shifts are starting to take place here. As a matter of fact, he changes his position on St. Anselm, not in this book, but by 1933, 1934. Before, he'd actually said Anselm's Fidens Quaerens Intellectum is one of the definitions of Christian philosophy. Later, he'll reverse his position. Blondel is getting ready to publish the Problème de la Philosophie Catholique. Maritain, his philosophy is going through several transformations that'll ultimately culminate in the Essay on Christian Philosophy, which will get reworked later on in his later 1930s works, like Science and Wisdom, and the Degrees of Knowledge, those sorts of texts, where he'll talk a little bit more about Christian philosophy. That's what's going on in this phase.